like a heavy eye roll for cynical 40-year-old animators. Sorry, I'm nerding out a bit.
Colin Jack.
He's worked on nearly 24 shows and movies, also a children's book illustrator.
An episode of Tiny Toon Adventures that explained the process of animation. This is a job and you can make things. Once I knew that this was an actual viable job, that was it. I was a children's book illustrator for a while, a storyboard artist for a number of studios in Canada. About 12 years ago, got a call from Dreamworks to come and work for them. And as artists, we always look outward. We have tunnel vision sometimes, not being present in the living space. But then hopefully we have partners that... I've picked the fantastic Mr. Fox. Great director, great source material. And then the trailer dropped, and admittedly, I was disappointed. I was just like, what is this? I grew up reading Roald Dahl books. It caught me by surprise when it came out. New but familiar things about that film in a Wes Anderson way, so it feels fresh. Totally translates to animation. George Clooney as Mr. Fox and Meryl Streep as Mrs. Fox. Bill Murray, it totally works. There's such a warmth to it too. It was one of the first movies I introduced to my son, both my kids.
Does the film mean so much to you because it's like this idea of fatherhood? Colin, for people who may not know you, could you tell me a little tiny bit about yourself, what it is you do?
I think I was a children's book illustrator for a while, then in Canada, and then I was also a storyboard artist for a number of studios in Canada, and I occasionally freelanced on features, and then about 12 years ago, got a call from Dreamworks to come and work for them. So I worked at the PDI campus for about 2.5 years until it closed down. And then I moved down to Los Angeles, where I've been at Dreamworks ever since, as a storyboard artist. And then most recently I had a story, and now I'm a director in development.
What a great path. There's nothing in there that would be necessarily predictable. There's certain scales and ladders that exist within the industry. Once you're kind of inside and at a studio and you're working through, it's like, it seems to be primarily storyboard artists become, like you said, story focused, and then director, which is a really interesting ladder to climb.
Yeah, it's kind of like it kind of seems like the norm. There are exceptions, and we have Pierre, who is a fantastic director who came, primarily from animation, but also can board like a crazy. His boards are fantastic as well. He can do anything. It's actually kind of annoying.
Pierre Perifel, you mean? Yeah,
exactly. Yes, Pierre Perifel. So he's kind of an exception, but a lot of us are former story artists. Yeah, for sure.
Do you have a memory of the first time that you used a visual to tell a story?
Oh my gosh, I think it was in a third grade classroom where they were like, "Oh, draw your weekend," and I would read Sunday Funnies with my my grandfather, so I would see the comics, so I drew it in little boxes, and but then it kind of went off the rails because it was only 3 drawings. I did 4 or 5 drawings because I was just this isn't very exciting, because I watched TV and I had cereal, and that was my weekend because I was in grade 3. So I sort of started taking it. It was yeah, but in this episode of The Real Ghostbusters, this happened to Ray Stantz, and I would sort of, I guess, crudely storyboard or reverse storyboard the episode that I was talking about.
I've never heard of someone doing that. Yeah,
he was great. Cause what was funny though is I put in a lot. I was furiously drawing this stuff, and then back then teachers loved to call out students that were very unique, and I didn't get it. And you know what? I remember the name of the kid too. It was James Scott. I was look what James Scott did. And I'm
where's James Scott now?
Oh, I'm sure he's fantastic and doing well somewhere. That's only James Scott's of the world's too.
Directing the next Studio Ghibli features, James Scott. I don't know how he did it.
Exactly.
That's so funny, isn't it? And
Yeah.
like if that's the first time you've done it, then there must have been some kind of connection to that, regardless of James Scott. Was there something? Was there something in that?
No, I think it was just sort of like I think I, always found a love for that stuff, and I think there was an episode of Tiny Toon Adventures that explained the process of animation and of like this is a job and you can make things. There's a career in it, and I had a very supportive grandmother who kind of like would anytime, because she knew I was way into animation. She was like anytime something on the news would happen or something animation related in Canada, she would record it. And like, when I would visit her, she's like, "Oh, I recorded this for you from the news." And that kind of it just fueled everything. So once I knew, I think around 9 or 10, that this was an actual like viable like job, that was it. And I was in. So I knew I wanted to get into animation, and then I kind of fell into kids books along the way for a minute, just to guess because I thought it would be fun, and um, yeah. It was for a time fun, and then it was like the balance of doing that plus a full time job as a story artist. It was just too much. So and it was kind of like weirdly seeking the approval of my young children at the time. So I was just like, look what Dad made. But then they're 13 and 16 now. They could care less. So at some point, the hero worship faded, so there wasn't really anything in it for me at that point.
You're not a prophet in your own land, unfortunately.
No, exactly. Once that went away, I was like, well, that's it for this.
Yeah, I'll seek the adoration of millions of other people instead. Yeah.
Exactly. If I can't get it here. The fun thing about that was like it was another way of simply telling a story, because I was boarding. I was boarding and I was illustrating at the same time. And one of my, like, I think my second children's book that I illustrated was a book called Toes on Toast, which featured a fox actually. And I, it was like a 30-page illustrated kids book, and I didn't understand the format so much, so I crammed each page with like as many like every line of text was like a drawing, and I would like fill it up. And so I sent the pages, and it was just so cool too, because you like you send it, you format it, and then you wait to hear from the publisher. And people in publishing are super sweet, even if they're like, "Oh my God, what has he done?" Which was basically the subtext of that phone call was like, so it's an embarrassment of riches, and we're working with our art director to cull the amount of drawings that you sent us, because I just approached it like a board artist. So I was just sort of like, drawing gags and stuff like that. So it was great because it actually taught me to like how to draw something very simply and get the point across, which actually helped me when I got into features a lot down the road. Ultimately, like it helped me with my storytelling when I was like going back into boarding.
There's an interesting question there that I've been thinking about recently. I don't know if this is a topic for this conversation, but I'm going to throw it out there and see where we go. Anime is a huge part of current culture. Like the way it's permeated Western culture now, I think is massive. And one thing for me that I've noticed a big difference between, let's say, people really attach personalities and lifestyles and whole things to animated show or anime shows that doesn't really necessarily exist in the West so much. It may for certain Disney things, but I think part of that might be the approach to storytelling. And I think for me, what I've noticed is if there's space in a Western animated film of exploring, let's say, taking a tour of a building, generally what you see is gags, right? you know, here's the characters, here's something funny that's happening. Whereas in anime, you kind of let the space breathe for itself. You know,
No, like it's like 3 or 4 really beautiful shots, and then you're into the space kind of. Yeah, yeah. It's a you know, and you know, not to, but I think like culturally, when you know, even the animation school that I went to, like almost 20 years ago, it was kind of like poo-pooed anime, like it, which you know, it was just sort of like, oh well, you know, because you look at some anime shots, because there's a limitation sometimes, they're really inventive with how they show scope and scale, like, and what, you know, animation that's done sort of on the West is like you have all the bells and whistles, so you have all the toys in the world, and you're allowed to do everything. So it was like really clever sort of cinematic tricks that you would do in, you know, frankly, like honestly, live action films that you wouldn't necessarily do in you know, a Western animated feature. So, but I think that's changing though. You know, like I'll cite Puss in Boots as being one that clear, and even, you know, Bad Guys, as you know, taking taking visual reference from, you know, anime, and it's sort of permeating Western films a little bit more, which I think is exciting. And also just you know, and again, I'm not like, hopefully not coming across like the teachers were very close-minded back when it was just sort of like what they were teaching was animation that was done on the West, and not really pulling in animation from other places. And I think because the world has gotten smaller, like it's like animation is, you know, being done everywhere, so why not pull from some, you know, truly great films?
Yeah, truly amazing work. And I think that's really interesting you hit on the Bad Guys there, because obviously Pierre's French, you know, and he's from France, and a lot of French, European, especially for me, I'm in Ireland, like we had the same thing. It was all stuff from Japan, just dubbed into English, you know. So we grew up with things like Sherlock Hound, and you can see the influence of that when it comes to the Bad Guys, you know, or Lupin the Third, and it like bleeds into that. And I really love the reference of Puss in Boots there, especially the more recent one. Beautiful film where it allowed moments to breathe, you know, really allowed that kind of space to happen, but it still had Western sensibilities. It's like a great fusion of storytelling.
I think it's great. I think like even you know, more, you know, recently, like there's been sort of like this, you know, wonderful moment in, I go to movies like once a week, but like there's been this wonderful, like, where, you know, movies that aren't necessarily made in these states have, you know, made it across here and done well here. But Godzilla Minus One being an example of like, oh yeah, like it's so good. And I saw it twice in the theater. I was like, just, well, I was breathless at the end of it, but like, you know, but it was just so, it's so nice to see. But also like you watch one of these films and you're kind of like, you're able to pull from that as like as an artist yourself, as a storyteller. It's like, wow, like they really took their time here, and their action sequences aren't very long, but they're so impactful because they spent all this time building this these characters, and that's really, really cool. And I don't know, I just I think it's an exciting time, and I love that, like, you know, Western animation is sort of taking a page out of anime books and other forms of animation as well, as we keep pushing medium forward. So I'm excited to see what happens.
Yeah, I'm really excited as well. Yeah.
My son, my 13-year-old loves One Piece, and I never cued him in on that. It was never like, hey, you should watch One Piece. You know, my extent of, I try not to like force my kids to watch things. I just tend to put something on, and they'll like meander to the couch with me. Like it's kind of like a lure of like, oh, this is really great. But One Piece is something that he discovered on his own, and he loves it. But I think it's there's something fun about, I think what they do in that show is like there's so much world building as well, and like just a wealth of characters and stories. So, but yeah, it's definitely seeping in.
Yeah, definitely. I think more so for older ones, because there's something about being a teenager online that just screams anime at you. I don't know what it is. Like, it's impossible to escape. even when I was a teenager in Ireland and we first got
Yeah.
broadband, it used to be dial-up where they had the like phone, noise every time you go online. I remember we got broadband and we had like a download limit of 1 or 2 gigabytes per month before it would slow down. And it was at the exact same time that I discovered, oh, I can download animated things. And my parents would scream at me because
It's broadband.
yeah, I was killing the speed that they were paying for. It was just like, why are we even doing this? I had to be really careful, like measure it, and I got really good at downloading crappy things just so I could get a story through. But yeah, I think there is just something about it just offers an escape, probably because of the series and, like you said, the scope. And One Piece, like, oh my God, that show just goes on and on. There's so much of it to discover.
Yeah. It's really, really cool.
There's a huge amount to discover in there. Anyways, we could talk about this forever. Sorry. Yeah, I'm diverging into my own topics here. But Colin, please, as with Animators Breakfast, you get to choose what you talk about, not me forcing you to talk about things. So I'd love to hear what you've picked.
Oh, I've picked the Fantastic Mr. Fox as something that it caught me by surprise when it came out. Well, we can fact check this later. I'm going to say 2009, 2010 was when the
2009 you got it. Yeah.
Because I was a fan of Wes Anderson, and you read in the trades he's doing an animated film, and he's not only doing an animated film, but he's doing Roald Dahl's Fantastic Mr. Fox, which I grew up reading Roald Dahl books. I love those books, and I always, as even as like in university, I would like draw drawings of Fantastic Mr. Fox, or even like other characters like Twits and Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. It's one of those things where I'm like, I always thought it was that his collection of stories were always great for animation, and it even goes back further than that. Like in grade 2, so I couldn't have been more than like 6 or 7. My teacher would do like story time, and like he read a few Roald Dahl books, Danny Championing the World, the Twits being another one, and Fantastic Mr. Fox. Twits being my all-time favorite, because they're just so awful. But Fantastic Mr. Fox is very much near and dear to my heart, and also like the illustrations of Quentin Blake in those books were Quentin Blake's a huge inspiration to me. Just how I draw fundamentally, just sort of like the carefree nature of how he draws. It's not carefree; it's very purposeful, but like it feels carefree. So all that, when I read it, I'm like, okay, so great director, great source material. This is I couldn't wait. And then the trailer dropped, and admittedly, I was disappointed at first. I was just like, what is this? And it gets back to that sort of being sort of in Western animation for so long. I was taken aback. I'm like, because I think I had in my head, like, and we can fact check this too, I was expecting kind of like very slick, really designed, taking Quentin Blake's drawings, but like sort of finding a way to like to build it into stop motion using face replacements, like really like Leica fancy stuff. Like that was what I was anticipating, and it wasn't that. And I was kind of like, oh. And then the movie came out, and I went and watched it, and I realized, like, I don't know if you remember this series, but there was a stop motion series called Wind in the Willows back in the 80s that I loved. And when I was watching, I'm like, and you do a little bit of research, and Quentin Blake wasn't the original illustrator of that book. It was an illustrator by the name of, and I can't remember his name off the top of my head, Donald Chaffin? Donald Chaffin.
Yes.
Yeah. And that and you look at those illustrations and what Wes Anderson and his team was doing, and it was, it's obvious what he was taking inspiration from. But then, yeah, like the film itself, and I've like watched it. I'm gonna say it was one of the first movies I introduced to my son and or both my kids, and it's kind of like a staple at the house of a movie that I've and it's a quotable movie for us at the house as well. It's, like I guess he's just different is something that we still do. But like it's just it's such a lovely film, but it's so funny when 'cause I watched it recently, I think like last week, and but having gone through so many animated films myself at DreamWorks, like it's funny how like there are a handful of like sort of animated film tropes that you don't see in because of the visual look of it being so different. They're still there in this film. Like there's a dance party at the end of this movie, which when you think about it, like and how many times have we all said, oh, the dance party at the end of a animated film, and kind of like like a heavy eye roll for cynical 40-year-old animators. But like you watch it in that, and you're like, it totally works. And the opening sequence being like this sort of epic action sequence, but it's done in a Wes Anderson way, so it feels fresh. There's a lot of new but familiar things about that film, and I'm sorry, I'm nerding out a bit. I'm blathering about it. I just there was like fun things of like using the word like cuss as like a all around swear word, so the characters could be a little more grown up and just a little bit more adult in certain areas. I just loved it. And the more I watch it, the more I appreciate. I love it more. There's the shot compositions on it are just so funny. Like just like we were talking about gags, but like isn't a character like falling and hitting their heads, or like though that does happen. But like it's like there's a shot where I think Ash, the Mr. Fox's son, is standing in the foreground. He's staring, at Christopherson. Mom's in the background, painting thunderstorms for some reason, and then he's like, "Do you think I'm an athlete?" And then Mr. Fox just peers behind Ash, and it's just like and he's like, it's hysterical every time because it's just like the timing of it is sort of like. You'd see that in a live action Wes Anderson film, but it totally translates to animation, and it's just so lovely, and there's such a warmth to it too, and that I loved as well. And the color palette was it's really just oranges and sort of warm tones, and then when things get dangerous, like they throw the color out, especially when they get into the sewer aspect. Sequence where the rat's there and he's going to murder Ash. It's such a bananas movie because he's addicted to cider. He's being paid in cider by Bogus. But yeah, I love it, and the cast also is just insane, and like having George Clooney like as Mr. Fox is just it's. Like there's nobody else that could do that, and and Meryl Streep as Mrs. Fox, Bill Murray, like it's crazy. I was fortunate. I'm fortunate enough. I was actually friends with one of the storyboard artists on that film, and he was throwing some stuff away, and he's like, "I've got some of these old storyboards from Fantastic Mr. Fox." So I was like, okay, hold on. Where are they? Can I see them? And can I have them? And I got them, and they're like the boards from when Mr. and Mrs. Fox were having their heart-to-heart on the waterfall, and they're beautiful.
Oh my god!
Yeah.
Oh my god! What a moment!
Yeah. And it like just and it's super nerdy, but like not official merchandise, but we found these great prints of the Fox family, and like that's the first thing you see when you come into my house are these like 4 pictures of like of Mr. Fox, Mrs. Fox, Ash, and Christopherson. Yeah, the movie meant a lot as like one of the first sort of cinematic exposures to my kids. Like it was one of the first movies I would introduce them to. It was like, this is fantastic, Mr. Fox. And for me, it was kind of like a lesson of, do not judge a book by its cover. Do not just judge a movie by its trailer, and don't, like, once you see what the filmmaker was really intending, like, watch the whole film, and and you understand it in execution what I think what Wes Anderson was trying to achieve. And it took me out of like that animation, sort of like Western animation comfort zone of like, animated films look a certain way. And I'm like, no, they don't have to look anyway. And for me, like, there's something like that in Isle of Dogs as well. It's just, they're so great. And the fact that there's a high level of attention to detail and just so much thought put into every single frame, and storytelling in every single frame. We're talking about illustration and like, making it very, like, there's such an illustrative quality to the whole thing. But the movie clips along at a great pace too, and I'm never not bored or entertained by it. So that's a long way of saying, like, I just adore that.
Does the film mean so much to you because it's like this idea of fatherhood, and also a person trying to, because he's trying to still be himself, right? He's got that call of the wild back to him, but at the same time he has to also look after his son Ash, who is trying his best to impress his father.
Yeah, he's trying. I mean, it's a guy who, it's very much a guy who's trying to get some of his glory days back, even though like he's not very present in his current situation. I mean, that's not autobiographical, but I think we can all kind of like identify with that as fathers, that you're kind of like sort of, you're kind of looking to like, that sort of element of, are you truly free? But like the truth is like he was, and like he could have done, and then he goes off and like nearly gets them killed because of his sort of like of his sort of like selfishness. But I think that what I loved about it, what I love about it still is just like the family dynamics of it all. Like, the father is kind of a dreamer, the mom is the pragmatist, but also like, a great artist. And the son is constantly, or just trying to be the fantastic Mr. Fox as well. And I loved, there's this great scene where he was like talking about, when I found out you were born, and like we're sitting there, we're digging through all this dirt, and then, but I was thinking, like, who's this guy going to be? And it's like, well, girl, you didn't know what you were having. Like, no step of my life. But like, I would say that I have 2 very precocious boys, but they are very much detail oriented as well. So like, I'll tell a story, and they're like, well, Dad, actually, like, so, it is. I think it does mean a lot to me in that regard of like just sort of a movie where it is a guy kind of wrestling with like his past and not focusing on the here and now of his and as artists we always look outward sometimes, or we focus on this and not, and so that's kind of what we have to do. But like we have tunnel vision sometimes, not being present in our living space. But then hopefully we have partners that bring us out of that, which I do. So,
which is exactly what happens in Fantastic Mr. Fox. Yeah, I thinking about the the movie itself, right? So obviously the director's Wes Anderson, who, as everyone in the world who knows that name understands, that there's going to be a very specific storybook aesthetic that comes with his work. But I will say before Fantastic Mr. Fox, he was still quite playful in how he approached things. But it seemed to be after Fantastic Mr. Fox that his style really started to unify.
Something clicked in it. Like, I think was Budapest and Moonrise Kingdom, like his next two movies, and then it was Isle of Dogs, right? Like, yeah. So, yeah, there was something there, like I think I remember seeing either in one of the art of books or maybe online of like them building out, these sets, and then, Wes Anderson would go in and like just knock out, like basically was taking things out most of the time just to like get the compositions just right or as symmetrical as they possibly could. So it was all kind of like, yeah, you can tell like but after that, you're right. It seems to get more and more and more storybook down to like, I watched Astro City a couple of weeks ago, and it is so designed. Every shot is planned, which is great. But you're right. I think you're right. That was probably a very important film for him in terms of his sort of visual aesthetic.
I think because he was a live action director deciding to do, like, this film obviously has multiple layers. You've got a live action director who's a very specific aesthetic, who's coming in to do a kid's storybook, essentially. And then on top of that, he's also coming in to do it as a stop motion animated project. Animation by any means is not an easy feat for anyone to start to do. And especially if someone's working in live action, like, it's a totally different process. Whereas in live action, you could be shooting all day and you've got 4 or 5 things that you need to get to. But then on animation, you could have 30 different shots happening at the exact same time all day. None of them are going to be finished that day. And you might see 1 or 2 seconds of that shot at the end of the day of like someone's eyebrow coming down slightly. It's a very different process. And it's like, where do I put my effort and energy, as opposed to live action? It's there, it's always there. Whereas here it's so spread.
And I imagine just how specific his films are, and he would, again, there's like a lot of, there's almost like urban legend quality to this movie in terms of how it was made and like how it was directed. And like, I think the general thing was that he directed from his iPhone, which I think what he probably did. And I think, I've talked to a few people who have worked on the movies, that he would shoot like performance pieces for himself, like for the crew, of like, here's how I want it done, and down to like even how they eat and stuff like that, and like which I was like, that's cool. Like, why? Like, if you are somebody who's coming from live action, you're not gonna sit down and board in detail or put keyframes. Like, you're gonna use the tools that you're used to, and like, why wouldn't you like use that as a way of like getting your vision across? Like, makes sense. I mean, we use, in Trolls, we had dance choreographers come in and like do all the dancing because just for frame of reference, because I don't know if you can probably assume that like a lot of animators, if for a handful of us, aren't the best dancers.
I mean, I've been to those after parties, I've seen the writhing masses, yeah.
Yeah, I think that is, you're probably right. Like, it's like watching this movie in slow motion kind of being assembled. I think, if I'm not mistaken, the late great Mark Gustafson was the animation director on it too, right? Like, yeah. So it was in good. I mean, it had a hell of a team around him to like achieve it.
And again, I remember watching Fantastic Mr. Fox. I was in college at the time when it came out, and of course, your brain is bigger than your boots in college, or at least you think it is. And I remember the same feeling of like, I had a very specific attachment to the book growing up, and I had a very specific idea of what this should be. And you're totally right. When I was like, where's Quentin Blake? They didn't understand this at all. And what's this? You're adding parts before and after. I was just like, what's going on? But the more I sit in life, and the more I've kind of gone back to it, because it's a film that keeps drawing you back in and back in. I was like, oh my God, I can't disagree with any of these decisions, because you've got Wes Anderson's film, you've got Noah Baumbach's script mixed with Wes, you've got obviously all this stop motion and all these different specific layers. But at the same time, as far as I know, they were very respectful of Roald Dahl's property. I know Wes Anderson lived in the house for a time while he was writing it with Felicity Dahl, Roald's wife, and they used a lot of the props that would appear in the Fox's house were just things in Roald Dahl's house.
Yeah, I mean, like, and it's funny because like the props and like the sort of like the way the house was designed, I think had an element of nostalgia for me because, you know, my grandparents were very much on my dad's side were very much members of the British Empire, and when they moved to Canada, like the house had all this sort of like, you know, like the tape recorders were like they had ones with like cords, like the TV had a cord attached to it, and like that's how they changed channels, and like there was a very retro quality of the house. It was like frozen in time, and it kind of when I was when you watch that movie, there's elements of like, oh, we had that, like that was you know, those the way the picture frames looked. I'm like, oh, we totally had those frames at Grandma and Grandpa's house. Even like the patterning on chairs where it's like this orange and brown, which, you know, you look at it in real life, you're like, why? But like in the movie, it totally works. The one detail I really loved was the board that Mr. Fox had, that he was in his chair, like this little like sort of board that he had where you can like write his notes and stuff, like, or his column. One of my favorite lines in the movie is like, do you know anybody who reads my column? It's like, oh yeah, I was talking to so-and-so the other day. He said, I should read Foxy's column. Like, nobody reads it. But I love the fact that apparently, because that's how apparently Dahl used to write his stories, where like he would sit in a chair with his tea and like have this board in front of him. And it looks like the board from the...
Because it does feel like they've basically modeled Mr. Fox on Roald Dahl, you know, like the specifically in his energies and maybe the suave nature of him, because you've obviously experienced Roald Dahl. You've read, like we all did. I did during school. You did during school. Anyone else who has, and we had to study Boy and Going Solo, and you know, so you see elements of his life. And when I watched Fantastic Mr. Fox later in life, I was just like, oh my God, it's so similar to him, but it's also, I know it's George Clooney, but it's not George Clooney. You know, it's got this great quality.
And it's just him being silly. Like the things that they're talking about are just so absurd. And when they are animal, like, and I love the pivot from like them sounding very sophisticated and learned to them snarling and hissing like animals, which is just a lovely, like, sort of the first time he eats. I remember watching in the theater, and then he eats, and you're just like, you know, there's a few great laughs, but that one was just like, you know, it was there with a very discerning audience of animation nerds, and everyone just like howling at that. It was just what a great idea. Like, you know, because we've seen how many all animal worlds have we seen in animation, and like what a great, you know, way to keep it fresh was like, oh, they eat like animals. Like,
have you seen the behind the scenes of any of the
bits and pieces of it? You know, it's funny. I used to love watching making of features, and then
you start making them.
And I started making them. But also it's just like, you know, it's like it's a way, because you know how those things are made, and you know how like and you don't want, like, part of me is like some of my favorite movies, like I don't want to know how the sausage is made. I just want to enjoy the film and like the politics around it, and like what it took. Like, you know, when you work on movies, like there's a lot of stories that swirl around the movies, and I was like, I just want to enjoy this for what it is. I know a little bit, and I've watched some, but like it's not been. I mean, I remember watching the special features of like them recording outside, and and I thought that was just also kind of like crazy, but also brilliant, because it's like, you know, I've been in a few record sessions, and you're asking people to like kind of be out of breath and run on the spot, but like in watching that, you're like, oh, they're just doing it, and I mean, somebody record as they went. So No, it was really smart.
Yeah, and fun as well, because you see the energy that, right, because you want a performance to ring through, and of course with animation there's two elements: there's the voice performance, but then there's the animator's input, right? And seeing George Clooney, roll around in the grass on a farm and do the character's dialogue is so much fun. Or how he eats the toast, like you say, he eats it himself like the animal. And him and Bill Murray hissing and snarling at each other in a farmhouse. You're just like, this is. But then that must be the live action sensibility coming through, right? Because you wouldn't think to do that otherwise. I don't think.
No, you wouldn't. You wouldn't even consider it because there's just been a way of making these things for so long, and when you see something like that, or that sort of out of the box problem solving, it's super inspiring to see. Another thing I loved about it was sort of the I lost my train of thought there for a long. It was just sort of like the like the wackiness of it, like the subtle. I would say it was subtle wackiness, but like there are just moments of it where you're kind of like, like honey, you're glowing, and then like it's just a completely different model, and there's like an inner light to them, and it's just, but like it's just things where it's like, kind of a semi-naturalistic world with as much naturalistic as animals with beautiful corduroy suits could be, but like there's a tactile greatness to it, and then they pop out and they do something as nuts as that. And even the special effects of it, where like you could go digital there, you really could, and then like he's climbing the fence and it's 2D animated, or the smoke is cotton balls or the equivalent of cotton balls. Like all that stuff was just sort of just such deliberate choices, down to like stuff like that, where it's just like, man, that is so smart. But also like the amount of preparation that the filmmakers had to do. And of course, like, I mean, we're saying Wes Anderson, but like also probably allowing a lot of great ideas from his crew, like to seep in and like find ways to do stuff, which I'd imagine would be somewhat easier digitally, but like just doing it this way, it was nice to see. And like that, in Isle of Dogs, it also being one of those things where it was nice to see that too.
Keeps the reality of that world very centered then, right? Sorry, reality might not be the word, but the verisimilitude, the absurdity of how it's all put together, it's still, there's a logic to everything that exists in the world, whether it's like Teflon paper or whatever, or water, or well designed sets, but everything's so specific, and at the same time, like you can tell when they switch between model sizes and in different, like within the same shots, you're just like, that's clearly a smaller model, but it doesn't break the rules of the world by any means. It kind of expands it.
Yeah, and I think and like the sort of the limitation of the medium that they were working in just sort of helped with kind of clarity on everything. Like you're never lost on where anybody is or what's happening, and like you can fall into those traps with animation of like getting all like swelled up with all the bells and whistles and all the all the things that we can do, that we kind of like lose focus. But your eyes always fixed on the shot, on what's intended to be, and you're always not lost. And like even though like there's a huge flood and like these characters are getting like sucked down the drain, like it's very easy to get like super like Michael Bay with it all, and like get in there and put everything on a Z-axis, and like it was just like water. Here they go, and it was 1, 2, 3. I mean, there's this great, like when they're pulling off their heists, like they do they do one and they go through the steps of them drugging the beagle, and but and then you get it right, like he does it the first time. The next time you see him pull up a heist, it's just a dude sitting looking directly at camera, and then like 5 or 6 monitors behind him, and you just see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, these kind of the same action, just shot in a completely different way, but it's hysterical. But like it you could have easily like, and maybe they did, but like gone through each and every one of their like farm heists kind of the same like way, but to do one as you probably would, and then like do one completely like just so efficiently, and then save the third and do the third one while you're introducing the Willem Dafoe's character, which, by the way, Willem Dafoe's in this movie. It's like it's just the same cast. I don't know. I thought like what a just a clean and sort of like lovely way of like establishing like he's back at it. He's doing what he loves to do, or what he thought he loved to do. But you're getting to it as quickly as you possible, because like the real problem is like he's now done this thing, and now there's a consequence to it. Whereas like Bogus Bunce and Bean are like, well, this is we are going to kill this guy. Like,
I think it's so interesting to think about then, because the book, I very clearly remember the book starts with the farmers right there. That's the first chapter, is introducing the farmers, and the book also ends with the farmers sitting waiting for him to come out of the hole. I mean, they're all just sitting in the rain with their guns, and I was just like, I was so excited to see what they did with those guys in the film, and they didn't disappoint at all, really.
No, and like just like there are so many different ways you could go with those characters, but like how sort of unique, and like the eerie little rhyme, which I think that is text from the book. Like, correct me if I'm wrong. The Bogus Bunce and Bean.
Oh, the little kids choir singing that. Yeah,
I loved that, and then like the fact that they made that like the score of like the third act action sequence of this children's choir while they're like rescuing Christopherson. I thought was just awesome. But yeah, those villains, and it's tricky in animation to like get a really great villain, but like or an antagonist. And I mean, really, the antagonist for Mr. Fox is Mr. Fox, and like his sort of like Bogus Bunce and Bean are just like a consequence of his actions, but like, but they're just great villains, and they feel dangerous. Like they don't, like they feel like as comical as they are, like, there's when they first meet and like how everything's going is like any Fox problems, and they start, kind of like ranting. And then I think Bean gets up, he does this like little like step, and then he starts rolling around the ground, shooting out lights because, and and then he's like, this is what we're going to do to deal with this guy. But it was just such a odd thing to do, but also it makes him kind of scary. And the first time you see him, he's like in shadow with like a cigarette, like you would introduce any kind of like any noir villain, really. And then like a cigarette, and like it's just the lights just hitting his eyes and stuff. Like, it's just a really clever way of like establishing a real danger. And when his tail gets blown off, it's not cartoony. Like, there's blood and bone. Like, it's serious. And but it's just done with such a great sort of specific touch that that's why I was so keen on introducing to my kids, because we're constantly like, you're constantly worrying about what's going to scare them, what's not. And like, this was kind of like that nice ground of like, there's legit stakes, but also it's done in such a way that, it's palpable for, a family audience, and especially when they're super young.
How young were they when you put on the movie and set them down? Yeah,
3 or 4.
Used to play it over their cradle.
Yeah, it's just like here. Yeah, just dropped a giant TV set on top of the cradle, and it was an enjoy. Yeah, they were very young, but like it's one of those things where you can only take so much of Elmo. And the other thing I loved about it was the is that you can see yourself in, like Mr. Fox being one of them, but you can also see yourself in, even Bill Murray's character of like, how many times have you been, you're like, you're about to say something, you think, and then somebody cuts you off, and it's just like, oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, it's just like, it's all those kinds of like, and Wes Anderson is great in like a lot of his movies of like, having those really socially awkward moments where like a character is kind of cut off or like made to feel like terrible, like they're like Ash, like telling Christopherson's love to like love interest just to beat it. Was I rude to her before? I'm like, yeah, you kind of were. Like,
I mean, poor Ash, really, if you think about a tragic story the whole way through.
I know it's like Ash can't win, but I mean, he gets that really sparkly bandit hat at the end. So, which I really loved because I thought it's a nice gag, but like when you think about it, it's like clearly Mr. Fox realized that he aced out his son, and like he was going to give him that bandit hat at some point, like like when the moment was right, like he made that, and like he bought it, and then he put little gold stars on it just to make it super special, just to let his son know that he mattered to him. And so it's that's the great thing about a movie like that, is like every time I watch it, I get something else out of it.
That's really powerful, actually, as well. Then, I think I've only seen it maybe, I would definitely say less than 10 times, which is still quite a lot for someone to have watched the film. But and I remember I had to rewatch it again when I saw Isle of Dogs. I was just like, okay, I definitely need to watch Fantastic Mr. Fox again, because it has this. Whenever I look at, if I Google Fantastic Mr. Fox, I see the typography. And I'm just like, okay, that feels very silly, and I see the characters. But then when I watch it, I'm just like, this is an incredible amount of depth to it and nuance that I don't necessarily think the advertising or the packaging of it really gets across, to some degree. But then again, it's been released as part of the Criterion Collection. It's one of the few animated movies, so it's this weird balance of like, oh, Fantastic Mr. Fox, and then, oh, Fantastic Mr. Fox.
I think it's like what's so great about animation as a medium is that it's kind of timeless, and I think it's like that. This movie in particular is one of those things where it's like, as time marches on, I think it's one of those movies that, like, any movie that I was I've been had a story on, or any movie that I'm working on currently, like it's one of those usually directors like have lists of films that you should watch just to get inside their brain, and Fantastic Mr. Fox is one of those films for me. But like it's to me, I think it's just almost like a masterclass in like visual storytelling and like effective visual story. How do you get story across so quickly and so effectively, so you can just sort of luxuriate in some of the character specific moments in the film. So
that's a really interesting point, because I think that's just the staple of really Wes Anderson from that point onwards anyways, is like, things are so clear visually. I remember even in Grand Budapest Hotel, when close-ups on those was it Mendel's chocolates, or and it's like, okay, we see the action happen, but then we see it happen close as well, so it's like a double whammy. Changing of aspect ratios, I know specifically in that film, really, really does incredible work. But here, like, I know there's one shot that always sticks out to me when he's like, they're doing their flips and they're breaking into the farm, and it kind of goes from close up to wide shot back to mid shot, but as the camera's tracking across, and everything's so clearly done, it's so specifically made. And I know he's a very, very visually particular person, because that's how his films are made. He knows how he wants these things to happen, but he also, as far as I understand, welcomes surprises from animators that help tell that story. Because I guess really, in a sense, like, animators are, as we know, but they are the actors, they really are the actors. They get the body language and everything across. So I'm not sure how many retakes. I don't know the specifics of this film, but it had a very modest budget in terms of animated films. I don't think it grossed very high either, did it? Do you?
No, I think like, I'm off the top of my head, probably maybe 40 million at the end when it's all said and done. But like, just think about that was 10 years ago and we're still talking about it. And, it's still, and I think it's, I see it on every streaming service. I have way too many of them, but like, I think I want to believe, I don't go to people on the street and like, hey, what's Fantastic Fox?
Because I got it.
I have to,
if you want it, man.
because
Yeah,
I got it.
yeah.
I got so many copies at home. But like, I have to assume it's one of those movies that even as like, burgeoning animators or people who are taking this as or pursuing this as a career is something that you would look at for sure. Like as a, especially if you want to get into boarding, especially, it's something that you should definitely look at. Because there's like, there are rules about what you think. We think that there's rules about storyboarding, but they're really, there are so many different ways to tell a story visually. And, the one thing that is true about all storyboarding is clarity and being clear. And, there's, somebody's going to correct me on this, but like there was a great quote because you should be able to read the drawing from across the room. Like even that's, with digital boarding, like you can fall into the trap of like, getting really noodly. But with, something like, what, with Fantastic Mr. Fox, it was like, if you were to reverse board that stuff, or we would see that as boards, like you would never, I don't think, lose sight of what your eye was fixed on. So I think it's important. I think it's an important movie to watch if you're pursuing, visual storytelling in animation, for sure.
What did the boards look like? You said you had to look at the.
It's so, I think, this particular, Patrick, his particular vibe, where you would be surprised. I think they are, you would think you were looking at like a Disney feature on like in terms of like how the foxes were drawn, because he draws beautifully, and I'm every artist has a different variation, but they're paper and they're marker, and they're really cool, and but they were very much, I feel, and they weren't like stepped out boards like you would probably do digitally. Like they were all on paper. So it was like wide shot, close up, dialogue underneath, and then like what the background would look like. So they can, when they were cutting it together in the animatic, that they could superimpose those like drawings on top of the background.
That's fascinating. I love that you say that it's a film that people should study for boarding. Yeah, I think that's a lovely thing to say, because when I look at your sketches, sketches as if your scribbles, when I look at your scribbles.
Let's not go twisted. They are absolutely scribbles.
Yeah. No, but I think there's a beautiful magic in it. But I really see in your art that, there is Quentin Blake in there. I can see that. I can feel that deliberate, rough and ready style. And, I was recently talking to Tom Moore about, I can't remember about what, about drawing or something, but he said something really fascinating to me, that like certain illustrators have this ability to make a virtue of the medium by it allows you to fill things in, right? It's not complete. And Quentin Blake is a really good example of that, where he can just capture just enough to make things feel, oh, okay, wow, I can imagine the world beyond these drawings. I don't need everything photorealistically drawn. I can see the world that my imagination starts to fill in. And I definitely see that in your work as well. I do. And I've read Frogs on Toast, or Toads on Toast. And I can definitely see that in terms of the world that you're creating,
Yeah. I mean, I think it's also like, it's one of those things where, especially with the boarding, I find that it's a preference. You know, like every board artist and director are different, but like I've seen a lot of story reels, and the ones that I gravitate towards are ones where there is less. And I think because everything's gone digital, we sound like an old man because everything's gone digital. But you know, there's an ability to design everything, to draw everything, and put shading on everything, and you know, put tone on everything. And like sometimes that's necessary to convey an emotion, but sometimes as a viewer, like I've seen beautiful story reels where nothing's left up to the imagination. Everything is like done to the nines, and I find those more difficult to watch than the ones that are kind of like a little looser, because you have like my imagination is doing the rest. Like, oh, that's gonna look amazing when that is, you know, built and lit, or what a funny, like that drawing is really funny for that moment because it is a funny drawing, and I'm focusing on the expression and not like all the beautiful detail around it. So, but that's a personal preference, that for me. But like, I think it's one of those things where, especially for, you know, storytelling, especially when you're visually storytelling, it's like simplicity is like important, to get you, especially when you're in those first few iterations, like, you know, simplicity and clarity is like what you should be aiming for, to just get everyone on board with what you're doing,
to get your point across. Well, I think that's a lovely phrase to end it on. But listen, I really, really appreciate your time, Colin. Thank you so much for this. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
And I'm glad that you got me to watch Fantastic Mr. Fox again. You know.
Oh yeah, it was such a chore.
That was the only reason. Yeah.
Yeah.
But no, listen, thank you so much for your time. I think there's some wonderful information in there for people, specifically around storyboarding and everything as well, because that's how your mind approaches things. So thank you. And it's nice to have someone to talk about Fantastic Mr. Fox with, you know?
It was fantastic.
Yeah.
There.
And I'll say it was Mr. Fox. Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah.